Greetings once again. I am Nelvilor Aviles Colyamat from Central Philippine Adventist College. We are still celebrating the National Bible Month and we are on the third day. And so I welcome all of you to Give Me the Bible. Our speaker today is no other than Dr. Victor Montaño, one of the faculty of the School of Theology of Central Philippine Adventist College. And so before we go to that, let us all sing our theme song, Give Me the Bible.
Give me the Bible, star of gladness gleaming, to cheer the wanderer, lone and tempest tossed. No storm can hide the peaceful regions beaming, since Jesus came to seek and save the lost. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day. Give me the Bible when my heart is broken, when sin and grief have filled my soul with fear. Give me the precious words by Jesus spoken, hold up its lamp to show my Savior near. Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.
Give me the Bible, all my steps enlighten. Teach me the danger of these realms below. That lamp of safety or the gloom shall brighten. That light alone the path of peace can show.
Give me the Bible, holy message shining, thy light shall guide me in the narrow way. Precept and promise, law and love combining, till night shall vanish in eternal day.
Hi viewers, good day. Welcome to our Bible program for our National Bible Awareness Month. The topic that we are going to consider today is about the truth of the biblical flood in the book of Genesis. When I was small, I was so fascinated and amazed by the story of Noah's Ark. This fascination continues even until today, that even a blockbuster movie was created in order to give us the amazement, the fascination, and the interest of the story about the flood in the book of Genesis. Recently, an image circulated in the Facebook of a picture of a flood with the caption, Noah, the first quarantined family. Indeed, every time we see in Facebook, in movies, even in stories about the story of the flood in the book of Genesis, it gives us an amazement of how the story is presented. The story of the flood in the book of Genesis is one of the remarkable events in the story of the Bible, yet it is one of the sharpest centers of controversy in the history of the warfare of theology and science. They believe that the story in the book of Genesis about the flood is a funny fairy tale story, inconceivable, and it comes from an invented imagination of a biblical writers. Because of this, many interpretations were presented in order to make the story not only fascinated or the story interesting, but also reliable to all of us. We have three questions to consider. First, how the story of the flood in the book of Genesis is being interpreted by scholars. Second, what are the case or arguments for the universality of the flood? And the third thing that would guide us in our presentation is the question pertaining to God's justice in the flood story. There are three major positions that being presented about the flood. The first one is the traditional. The second is the non-literal position. And the third one is the limited or local position. In the traditional view, it holds that the flood is a literal event that happened in the book of Genesis. That it is global, worldwide, and universal in nature. This kind of view rests on the biblical arguments and evidences that we can get from geology, biology, and anthropology. According to this traditional view, there was a catastrophic flood that happened during the time of Noah. The second view is the non-historical view or the non-literal position or view. This is the prevailing view of the historical critical scholars who hold to a symbolic interpretation of the story of the flood in the book of Genesis. Many scholars along this line believe that the flood was a myth designed to teach a theological or moral lesson. Accordingly, this flood is theologically motivated, and the account of the flood comes from three or two different literary sources from the ancient Near Eastern texts or sources. Then, what happened is that out from these two different sources, there was a final redactor who get the story and make the story like what we have in the book of Genesis. For them, the flood event is just a myth, a fable, a fairy tale, a hyperbole fabricated to teach moral lesson. For the limited and local view, this group of people believe that there was a record of the flood in the book of Genesis, but the flood is not universal in its extent, but limited and narrow. This view rests more on the evidences of science and the seeming difficulties in geological, biological, and anthropological problems. Local flood proponents, while rejecting the universality of the flood, has accepted the theory of uniformitarianism, which assumed that Earth's geology evolves gradually over a million years ago, or that the shape of this Earth happened only by a gradual or non-catastrophic process. An example for this is the Diluvia as evidences for the local flood. Theorists interpreted this as coming from An ice age event happened over 5 million years ago. I will not be presenting to you arguments from geology and biology. I will just refer you to these two big books that would help us understand what are the evidences of the universality of the flood in geology and biology. The first book is Faith, Reason, and Earth History by Leonard Brand, and the second one is Noah's Flood from William Ryan and Walter Pittman. What I will be presenting to you here is the case for its universality based on the biblical arguments. The first one is the biblical terminology expressing the global extent of the flood. If we try to read chapter 6 and 9 of the book of Genesis, we can encounter words like humankind, I will destroy humankind, words like the earth without accompanying genitive of limitation, or phrases such as upon the face of the earth. These are universal expression of the events. Another one is the face of the ground. The word all flesh, the end of all flesh, every living creatures, every living things, all those whose nostrils was the breath of life. Words and phrases like everything on earth, under the whole heaven, all the fountains of the deep. These are words, terminologies expressing a universal extent or global extent of the flood. In Genesis chapter 6 to 9, we have at least 30 different expressions of universality in the record. The second line of evidence or arguments for its universality is the New Testament explicit or unequivocal collaboration, unquestionable evidences in the New Testament. We have the record in Matthew chapter 24 verses 38 to 39, where Jesus Christ expresses the historicity of the universality of the flood. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Apostle Peter in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5 also expresses a collaboration of this historicity about the globality of the flood. In 2 Peter 3:6, it tells us that the world was destroyed, being flooded with water. In 1 Peter 3:20 and 1 Peter 3:21, the type and the antitype, that the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 sons, were saved through water. And later on, Peter explained that this was the antitype which points us to our salvation through the baptism and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. And also, Apostle Paul in Hebrews 11:7 also inform us about the historicity of the flood of Noah recorded in the book of Genesis. These are the New Testament collaboration of what had happened in the time of Noah. If we study Genesis 1 until 11, we have themes like creation, which points to its globality, the universality of sin, the universality of the plan of redemption. The sinful conditions of the entire human race is presented in these chapters. The universal covenant, the genealogies, the dispersion of the nations. These are but the the themes, the trajectory of the themes in the book of Genesis that points to its universality, as well as the flood story in the book of Genesis. Another line of evidences is the flood tradition. It has been argued that the flood is universal with respect to man. It means that all races coming from the family of Noah carried with them a common body of tradition, a common story, a common line of story, which is due to the origin of all people from the sons of Noah. It carried with them facts, essential facts about the story of the flood, although these facts were later on distorted, twisted, and supplemented. Moreover, another case for its universality is its purpose. The purpose is to destroy all humanity, according to Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 to 8. In order to accomplish this, only a universal flood is needed and not a local one. Furthermore, its universality is also presented in Genesis chapter 7, verses 23 to 24, where we could see there that the report of the narrative in these verses is from God's perspective. The flood does not record Noah's perspective, but from God's viewpoint in heaven, because Noah has a limited vantage point because he was inside the ark. When Genesis chapter 7 verse 20 says that 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered, this was a report from the perspective of God and not from Noah. Now let's go to another case. The next part about the issue in the book of Noah. And this is the issue of God's justice. For some, many believe, or for many, they believe that God is a powerful, transcendent, monarchical, yet vindictive God in the story. That God was perennially angry with the people during the time of Noah. That he was distant, punitive, and strict. This was the common understanding about God when the flood occurred in the book of Genesis. Is this true? If we study the context, we could see there that in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 to 8, God saw the wickedness of man, that this wickedness was great, that every intent of his heart was only evil continually. This we could see that the context of the flood is about the sins of the flood generation. This is the picture of a total, irredeemable corruption of human race. God sees the corruption, and the term used here to indicate is something which is no longer fit for its intended use. The cause of this corruption is violence, which is associated with social justice, or the incapacity to distinguish between sacred and profane. Violence committed here is a technical term for the oppression of the weak by the strong. It is a violence, breach of just order, a violation of order laid down and guaranteed by God. God saw how great the man's wickedness on earth. God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way on the earth. There was a portrayal of human degeneracy, human dystopia. The world was in a fallen state, a horrid condition. a horrid degeneracy of human heart beyond recovery in God's estimation. And because of this, God had mercifully bringing into completion the ruined state man had already wrought. Humankind ruining God's creation is followed by God's judgment act of cosmic uncreation. God's act of destruction was not arbitrary. He destroys what humanity had already ruined and corrupted. So much so that in Genesis chapter 6, verse 7 says, "So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created." An act of addressing the problem of violence and ruin that happened in this world because of man. If we study the context, we see that there is a contrast between humanity and the Creator. God saw that there was wickedness, and when the Lord saw human wickedness upon the earth, that it was so great. Genesis chapter 6, verse 6 tells us that the Lord was so sorry that He had made man on the earth. And the text says that He was grieved in His heart. We see the contrast, man's human wickedness versus God's sorrowful act, that He grieved in His heart. His heart was filled with pain. He was a suffering God in this event. God suffered with us just as He suffered for us. Humanity's ever-increasing evil firmly anchors the meaning of the flood, and God's suffering and grieving's heart provoke Him to intervene to stop its headlong slide into evil. The flood then was not an act of wanton destruction by a capricious God. God was acting to restore the goodness of His creation, ruined by fallen humanity. God does not take pleasure in the flood. The book of Genesis highlights its wickedness. God made the earth to be a place where humanity could flourish and be blessed, but instead, humanity turned it into a theater of violence and disaster. Now we see the picture of God grieving. His heart was so sorrowful. Our Creator was so sorry. He grieved because of what had happened. God does not take pleasure in the flood. We could also see that during this time, God established His covenant with fallen humanity. And also before the flood would come, God gives warning in advance. Where in fact there was a rainbow after the flood, telling us that God remembered His covenant with us. This was the kind of picture of God. God's mercy, God's goodness, and God's love is presented in the story. In the story, God is a person involved in our sufferings. He is not a transcendent being who sits in heaven like an angry monarch, watching with detached interest in all the pain and the suffering that goes on in the world. He himself, into compromising situation, takes the blame for the horrible human event and gets hands dirty in the tragedies of life, even offered His life for us. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon Him. God suffered with us because of our transgression. In the flood, we have the picture of Jesus, the type of suffering and grieving God, full of love, sympathy, compassionate, and merciful, with His life example accompanied by His acts of healing, forgiving, and redeeming. May this message will help us find a picture of God who is a God of love in the story of the flood in the book of Genesis. May God bless you all.
We surely praise God for that inspiring and wonderful message today. It's now time for our quiz. I will be reading 2 questions, and if you know the answer, you may send to us your answers through the mobile number that will be flashed on the screen. Here is question number 1. Is there an evidence of global flood? If so, please give the evidence. Is there an evidence of a global flood? If so, please give us the evidence. Question number 2. What are the 3 interpretations of the biblical flood? What are the 3 interpretations of the biblical flood? Please send us your answers. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you can join us again tomorrow. Happy New Year and God bless you.
I believe in the sun, even when it is not shining, and I believe in love, even when there's no one there, and I believe in God, even when He is silent. I believe through any trial, there is always a way. But